Another puzzle for you here today. Same deal as always, white to move, mate in 3. Take a few seconds and see if you can solve this one. Alright, 3, 2, and 1. So, again, there's only one move you can play here as white that will secure the game for you, and that is queen to e7 with check. Now you have to accept the sacrifice. If you don't, then this h6 pawn is very nicely placed to give checkmate with queen to g7. So after you play king captures e7, there's a very, very specific move you have to play here, and that is c8, creating a knight. This opens up a double check, that's not the king square, a double check from these two pieces, and the knight cuts off the d6 square from the king. So the king is forced to go back to e8, and finally you give checkmate with knight to d6 checkmate. And just as an added bonus, it throws in a royal fork as well, but that's not quite as important. So if you figured this one out, then congratulations, and either way I hope you enjoyed. Let's get on to the game. The score currently stands 3-3 in this 1-6 match, and Anderssen in the last game finally played a really nice game for the first time in a while. As I've said a few times, he's constantly been playing bad positions pretty much out of the opening, getting hammered in the endgame and losing quite often, but last game was his first good game in a long time. He was able to answer Harrwitz's King's Gambit almost flawlessly, answered every question that was thrown at him, and was able to convert what turned out to be a very brutal game. So now in Game 7, Anderssen has the white pieces, and he would love nothing more than to regain the lead for the first time since Game 1. So let's see what happens. In game number 3, if you recall, Anderssen went for e4, and he got battered by Harrwitz's French defense. In game number 5, he tried d4, and was unable to navigate a Queen's Gambit declined. But in game number 7, Anderssen goes back to his roots. We have an e4 opening, and now we'll see what happens. So Anderssen-Harrwitz, game 7, let's get it going. So e4 from Anderssen, and now not going for e6 or e5 like Harrwitz has played before, but he again switches up the opening with c5. So we have a Sicilian, d4 from Anderssen now, c captures d4, and now knight to f3. Now a common move order back in the day would be to just play knight to c6 and you would transpose into an open Sicilian, but here Harrwitz accepts the gambit and plays e5. Now, obviously, you can't play knight captures e5 because just queen to a5 check hits the king and picks up the rook, knight, sorry. So bishop to c4 instead by Anderssen, simply developing, knight to c6, and now knight to g5 with a double attack on f7. We have knight to h6 defending, and now f4. Anderssen goes full steam ahead. We have d6 defending the e5 pawn, and now castles. Bishop to g4 by Harrwitz. And now Anderssen really has to think a little bit. It's very clear that he's in an all-out attacking mood. He's going for f7 right away, he's pushing f4, he's getting his rook on this file that he's reeling, he's preparing to rip open. But this move is the time for patience. Here, the bishop is attacking the queen, and any move that gets the queen out of the bishop's attack is perfectly fine. But Anderssen, I think, was really, really antsy this game because he right away opens things up with bishop captures on f7. Now let me tell you, this sacrifice is not justified. Harrwitz will lose castling privileges because king to e7 is played here. You can't play knight captures f7 right away because you lose your bishop. Well, you could play it, but it's not quite optimal. So king to e7 would have to be played. But now what do? Your queen is still under attack, and you still have to move it. This knight defends it, so you have to make some move that I talked about in the previous move. So here Anderssen plays queen to e1, and now knight captures on f7 is played. So now the question Anderssen has to answer is, where is your attack? What is your compensation for this sacrifice? So I don't think it's too surprising that since Anderssen castled and put his rook on the f-file, that he plays f captures on e5. He tries to open it up this way. Another idea that could possibly be done is to play f5 instead. Now you have threats of knight to e6 and queen to h4 with check. This could be one way to regain the piece. So black would have to play king to e8 right away to get out of that check. And after knight to e6 and queen to d7, what's your idea here? You can try to trap the bishop with h3, but after bishop to h5 and g4, black can actually just play bishop to g6. And now you can't take this piece because your own knight would be hanging, so there's no way to regain the piece right away. There is some compensation for the piece, especially because with all of the pawns on light squares, the dark squared bishop actually has quite a bit of mobility, except for this knight here, of course, that will be taken care of later. So there is some compensation for this piece, definitely more than in the line that Anderssen plays, which I'll show you momentarily, but I do not believe that it's enough to justify sacrificing an entire piece. So Anderssen instead tries to open things up with f captures on e5, but simply knight f captures on e5. Now you're keeping the f file somewhat closed. Of course, the f7 square is not up for grabs just yet. So what do you do here as Anderssen? He continues with c3, very straightforward idea in most of these gambits. You just want to play d captures c3 and knight captures c3 for a very easy developing move. So Harrwitz, of course, denies this and just plays d3. This pawn is protected, and it's going to be quite annoying. h3 from Anderssen here. And now Harrwitz, a big theme that he's going to go on for this game is that he's going to be playing very safe. Of course, having a piece sacrificed against him, I think he was a little bit intimidated. So he moves the bishop back to e6. A way I think he could have forced resignation pretty much immediately would have been to play bishop to e2. And now what do you do here? You have to move the rook somewhere. Let's say rook to f2. And now just h6. You hit the knight. Now, you can possibly sacrifice the exchange here, but if you want to stop yourself from sacrificing too much material for no reason, you'd have to play the knight back to f3. And after knight captures on f3 and g captures on f3, black can play queen to d7 to hit the h3 pawn. And after king to h2, you can play g5 here as black. And now black has the material advantage, the development edge, and all of the initiative. There's just no way that white can get a game going here. It would be complete domination. But bishop to e6 isn't a bad move. It's still completely reasonable, just doesn't, drive home the point quite as easily. So bishop to e3 from Anderssen, and now king to d7. We have knight to d2, bishop to e7, now attacking the knight, and there's no good way to save material here. Of course, the f3 square, as previously mentioned, is currently defended. So we have knight captures on e6, of course, at least just picking off the bishop pair. King captures e6, and now queen to d1. Now there is a little bit of poison in this position. On Anderssen's side, of course, his rook still controls the only open file, and if this knight is able to move, then there are potential ways that the queen can infiltrate through the light squares. For example, if Harrwitz plays some slow move, then Anderssen has, for example, knight to c4. Now this isn't something that Harrwitz would fall for. This is definitely something you trick somebody with in online blitz. But if you were to play knight captures c4, you have an oh no my knight moment with queen to g4 check, and after king to e5, queen f5 would be checkmate. This specific line would never happen, but I just want to illustrate that despite being down a piece, Anderssen does have some ideas here. So Harrwitz, again, playing very safe, goes with the king back to d7. Of course, he just wants to hide his king somewhere, possibly along these dark squares, if possible. And now bishop to d4 from Anderssen. We have bishop to f6, now trying to close off the f file, and b4 from Anderssen. We have knight captures on d4, c captures on d4, and now knight back to c6. And this is part of the problem with the sacrifice. Anderssen doesn't really have any initiative, and it's actually Harrwitz that's doing all of the attacking right now. So what do you do here as Anderssen to try to make something happen? Well, we have queen to g4 check. But as previously mentioned, and Harrwitz can escape through the dark squares with king to c7, and now rook a to c1. At the very least, he's able to pin the knight. We have bishop captures on d4 with check. There's nothing saying that the bishop can't get into the action. King to h1, and now king to b8, getting out of the pin. Now here Anderssen plays knight to b3, and you sort of get the same vibes as you got from game number 4, where even though Anderssen's position isn't good, he's still playing to his outs, right? There are ways that he can play this game, again, if Harrwitz gets a little careless, which we know he can. For example, again, if he plays some slow move like a6, there is the chance for Anderssen to sacrifice the exchange with rook captures on c6. Now he actually gains material from this because after b captures c6, the bishop is still hanging on d4. And of course, this comes with the threat of knight captures on c6. This would fork the monarchs and win even more material. So after queen to b6, getting out of the attack and hitting the knight, queen to g7 could come. This would protect the knight, hit the rook. So rook all the way over to c8, and now knight to f5. You could get further attacks here on the d6 pawn. So after rook to a7, queen back to g3, again keeping the pressure up. You could play rook to d7 and now rook to d1. Of course, you still have to keep an eye on this passed pawn. That's something that Harrwitz will always have at his disposal. And now, if you ask the engine, it will say you want to play c5 here. And after b captures c5, rook captures c5, and queen captures on d3. This is an endgame I think I'd like to see a pair of modern masters try to play, because I'm not actually sure if black has the means to grind this one out, but it would certainly be interesting. But again, you get a position where black could win, but not might be able to, compared to what you see here, where black is just up a piece and is doing perfectly fine. So again, Harrwitz, he's been very careful this whole game, and he continues being very careful. He plays the bishop back to f6. And I want to make it clear that careful is not a bad thing. Harrwitz is making very good moves. There was that line a little bit ago where he played bishop to e6 instead of bishop to e2, and that wasn't like super duper precise, but these are all good moves he's making. So now the problem is that this rook captures on c6 idea doesn't quite have as much bite now, because of course you can't capture anything on d4. But the question is, what else does white play? Of course, Anderssen, this whole match, has been playing every single game for the win. And if you do not play rook captures on c6, you have no winning chances. You're just going to lose this endgame a piece down. So with that in mind, I don't think it's too surprising that Anderssen continues going forward with rook captures on c6. If he doesn't do this, he's just lost. There's no other way to put it. We have b captures on c6, and now even e5. Anderssen needs to use the 4th rank for his queen. So we have bishop captures on e5, and now knight to a5, again with the attack on c6. This still comes with a royal fork. We have queen to e8, and now queen to c4, the reason behind the pawn sacrifice. Now this position is very spooky. This knight captures on c6 idea is renewed. The queen defends f7, so rook to f7 could come if Anderssen needs another attacker, and it's a very tense position. So what I want you to do here, pause the video, take a look at the position, and see if you can figure out what Harrwitz should play here as black. There are a few good answers, and of course, like this whole time, there's a couple safe moves, but there is one move that just drives the point home almost instantly. Okay, 3, 2, and 1. Now, if you want to play safe, then bishop back to f6 would be one of the engine's top recommendations, but the move that really drives the point home is d2. You tell Anderssen, you do not have an attack here, and I am perfectly fine. So what's the idea? After knight captures on c6 with check, you don't want to move the king anywhere onto the c file where the knight could come with discoveries, so the king would have to go to b7. We would have knight back to a5, and now you don't want to go back and allow a perpetual, so king to b6. Now there would be queen to d5 from white with the threat of queen to b7 checkmate, or if this queen were to move, you would also have queen to c6 checkmate ideas. But queen to d7 deals with both of these. And after the knight goes back to c4 with check, king to c7, and now there is no way to continue this attack. You could try queen to a5, but just the king would go over here to b8, and with both of these squares being covered, there would be no way to continue this attack. So you would have to play queen captures on d2. Also worth noting that you can't bring a rook into the game with rook to f7, because again, just d1 creates a queen. You trade here, and white's just down 2 rooks. There would be no more counterplay, and I think even Anderssen would have to resign at this point. But for the one time this game, Harrwitz does not play carefully. It costs him. Here Harrwitz plays c5, trying to remove this threat altogether, and believe it or not, this just loses on the spot. Here Anderssen plays queen to d5, and believe it or not, it was here on move 28 that Harrwitz resigned the game. Anderssen does it again. He pulls a swindle out of seemingly nowhere, and is able to pull off the win. Now, there isn't necessarily a forcing line here. There's a few things that black could do, but none of them are good. The threat here is, of course, just queen to b7 with checkmate. Now, again, rook f7 is a thing, so you can't exactly move the queen onto the 7th rank. One potential idea you could try is king to c7. but after queen to b7 with check, king to d8 is forced, and now knight to c6 with check. Here you would be forced to play queen captures c6, and after white plays queen captures c6, you would just be up a queen, but in exchange black would have a rook, a bishop, and a whole bunch of pawns. I don't know if it's objectively correct for black to resign here, but I assume that Harrwitz just didn't really feel like playing after throwing away the advantage in such a tough game. He had played so cautiously this whole time, and his defense was actually really good. But just one mistake, c5, and suddenly it's all over for him. So yeah, that's game number 7. I'm not exactly sure if I want to consider this a swindle, like in game number 4, because Anderssen was pushing this whole time, right? He was attacking, he was keeping Harrwitz on his toes the whole game, and finally Harrwitz slipped. It's not quite the same situation where it was Harrwitz that was just better the whole time, and Anderssen laid a trap for him that he missed. I don't know. If you want to consider this the same thing, then I suppose it's fine. I think I will, just for consistency, but there is a discussion to be had about that. So yeah, Anderssen gets the lead for the first time in this match since game number 1. He goes up 4-3, and with only 2 more wins, Anderssen would win the match and would have his first professional scalp against a player of the tier of Daniel Harrwitz. So game number 8 will be out very soon, and you can look forward to that. I look forward to seeing you there. Until next time, take care.